It all started on a cold October night, one that would lead three friends to the brink of disaster. They had no idea that this night would change everything forever. Mason, Drew, and Liam sat in the back of a grimy bar, their drinks half finished and their conversation heavy with the weight of shared disappointments. Suddenly, a stranger approached their table, his face partially obscured by the shadows. He leaned in close, his voice barely a whisper. "You three look like you could use some help," he said, slipping a small piece of paper onto the table before disappearing back into the crowd. The tension thickened instantly, and the three friends exchanged uneasy glances, a sense of impending danger settling in. The flickering neon lights above them matched the uncertainty they all felt deep inside. Each of them had something to prove, and each of them would soon discover just how high the stakes really were. The bar was dimly lit, with neon signs flickering across stained tables and worn leather booths. The air was thick with the smell of stale beer and cigarette smoke, and the low murmur of other patrons created an undercurrent of tension that matched their mood. Life hadn't been easy for any of them lately. Mason, street smart but down on his luck, needed money fast, and he was tired of playing it straight. Drew, the cautious one, was recently engaged and was about to leave his thrill-seeking days behind for good. But here he was, dragged into the meeting by Liam, the perpetual risk-taker. Liam had always thrived on adrenaline, gambling away what little he had in search of the next rush. But tonight, there was more at stake than just the thrill. He had debts, serious debts, to dangerous people, and they were breathing down his neck. Tonight, that rush was something bigger. A pawn shop heist on Halloween night. A desperate attempt to pay off those who wouldn't take no for an answer. "Look, it's the perfect setup," Liam said, leaning forward, his eyes gleaming under the dim lights. "No one's paying attention on Halloween. Too many costumes, too much chaos. It's the ideal time." Drew sighed, his fiancée Erica's warning echoing in his head. He clenched his jaw, running a hand through his hair as he tried to shake the feeling of doubt. Her voice lingered, as did the weight of her concern. He remembered her pleading with him just the night before, her eyes filled with worry, her voice trembling as she touched his arm. The gentle pressure of her fingers had lingered, grounding him even as his resolve weakened. "Drew, please listen to me," she had said, her voice breaking. "Mason and Liam are trouble, Drew. Please stay out of it. I can't stand the thought of you getting mixed up in something dangerous again." She didn't trust Mason or Liam, and she had begged Drew to stay away from whatever scheme they were cooking up. "You sure about this?" Drew asked, rubbing the back of his neck. "I mean, what about Erica? I promised her." "One last thrill, man," Liam said, grinning. "Besides, we've got Jake. He's the inside man, works at the pawn shop. He's got it all figured out." Mason nodded, his face serious. "We do this right, we're set for a while. No more scraping by, no more worrying about bills. Just one job." Drew hesitated, his stomach in knots. He wanted out, but the desperation in Mason's eyes and the manic confidence in Liam's pulled him in. Against his better judgment, he nodded. The night of the heist, they gathered in an abandoned parking lot near the pawn shop. The air was cold, and a light fog had rolled in, giving everything an eerie glow. Jake was already there, his demeanor cool, almost detached. As they approached, Jake glanced at his phone, a brief flash of concern crossing his face before he quickly put it away, hiding the screen from the others. Something about his movements hinted at ulterior motives, but he kept his expression calm. He wasn't a friend, not really. Just a guy Liam knew, someone who had offered his expertise for a cut of the profits. "No weapons, no noise," Jake said, his voice calm but commanding. "We've got 3 minutes once we're in, and there's a new guy joining us, Caleb. He's a locksmith." Caleb stepped out from the shadows, a wiry guy with nervous eyes. He shuffled his feet, his gaze darting around as if expecting trouble from every direction. His hands fidgeted by his sides, and he kept glancing over his shoulder, making it clear he wanted to be anywhere but here. He looked like he wanted to be anywhere but here, but Jake's presence seemed to keep him in check. Mason shot a questioning glance at Liam, who just shrugged. "He owes me," Jake said simply. They moved quickly, Drew feeling his pulse pound in his ears. As they approached the pawn shop, Drew's phone buzzed. It was Erica. He ignored it, shoving the phone back into his pocket. They couldn't afford any distractions. They were almost at the back door when headlights flashed across them. Drew froze, his breath catching in his throat. A cop car rolled by, slowing as it neared. Liam tensed up, his hands instinctively clenching at his sides. The air felt thick with the threat of being caught, every second stretching unbearably long. Officer Tate. Everyone in town knew him. The guy who never let anything slide. Tate eyed them from his window, suspicion clear in his gaze. For a tense moment no one moved. Then Tate nodded, his expression warning, before he drove off. Drew let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "We should call it off," Drew whispered. "That was too close." "No way," Liam hissed. "That was nothing. Let's go." Inside, the pawn shop was dark, the air thick with the scent of old metal and dust. The floorboards creaked under their weight, and the distant sound of traffic outside filtered in faintly, adding an eerie backdrop to the otherwise silent shop. Mason brushed aside a cobweb that clung to his sleeve, grimacing at the stale, musty smell that seemed to grow stronger with each step. Caleb worked quickly on the locks, his hands trembling slightly. They slipped inside, each man moving to his designated area. They had practiced this, knew where to go, what to grab. But as they moved through the shop, a sound stopped them cold, faint rustling from the other side of the building. "What the hell is that?" Mason whispered. "Probably just street noise," Jake said, but Drew saw something in his eyes, a flicker of uncertainty. The truth revealed itself moments later. Another group was there, breaking in from the opposite side. Drew's heart pounded as they came face to face in the storage area. 4 men, led by a guy named Rico, who looked just as shocked as they did. Rico's expression shifted, and after a tense pause, he raised a hand. "All right, listen. Maybe we can work something out here," he said, forcing a grin. Drew exchanged a wary glance with Mason, and they all nodded reluctantly, agreeing to a temporary alliance. But Drew couldn't shake the feeling that Rico had something else in mind. As they gathered the loot, Rico stayed close, watching them, his eyes betraying a different intention. When the chaos broke loose after the display case crashed, Rico's grin turned into a sneer as he suddenly turned on them, shoving Mason aside and grabbing a bag of valuables. "Thanks for the help, boys," he hissed before disappearing into the shadows, leaving them betrayed at the worst possible moment. "Who the hell are you?" Rico barked, his eyes narrowing. Mason stepped forward, trying to defuse the situation. "Look, we don't need trouble. We split the loot, we all walk away." Rico sneered. "Not a chance." His eyes landed on Caleb, who was visibly shaking. "This one looks ready to piss himself," he said, stepping closer. Before anyone could react, there was a loud crash. Drew had backed into a display case, sending it toppling over. Mason flinched, his eyes wide, while Rico let out a furious shout. The tension in the room shattered along with the glass, chaos erupting as everyone scrambled to react. The noise was deafening, shattering the tense silence. Rico turned, his face twisted with rage, and the room erupted into chaos. Jake moved quickly, too quickly. His eyes were cold and focused, his movements deliberate as he pulled out a small keychain and pressed a button. There was no hesitation, no nervousness, just a calculating confidence that made Drew's stomach turn. The sound of metal locks echoed through the shop, and suddenly the exits were sealed. The lights flickered, then went out, plunging them into darkness. "Jake, what the hell are you doing?" Mason shouted, his voice panicked. "This was never about splitting anything." Jake's voice came from somewhere in the dark. "You idiots were just the distraction." Drew's stomach dropped. He could hear Liam cursing, the sound of a struggle. In the dim emergency lights that flickered on, he saw Jake shove Liam into a storage locker, slamming it shut. Mason was at the window trying to break it, but it was reinforced glass. They were trapped. The minutes that followed felt like an eternity. Drew could hear Mason muttering under his breath, trying to keep his fear in check. Caleb was on the floor, his back pressed against the wall, his eyes darting back and forth. The other crew, led by Rico, was shouting angrily from the other side of the shop, their voices filled with rage and confusion. It was clear now, Jake had orchestrated all of it, and they had all walked right into his trap. Then came the sound no one wanted to hear, the distant wail of a police siren. The silent alarm had finally been tripped. "We have to get out of here," Drew said, his voice cracking. Caleb stepped forward, his eyes wide and his entire body trembling. He hesitated, his gaze darting nervously between the others as if weighing his options. His hands fidgeted, and a bead of sweat rolled down his forehead. His voice was shaky as he spoke, barely above a whisper. "There's a maintenance hatch in the back," he whispered, swallowing hard. "I can get one of us out." "One?" Mason shouted. "We all need to get out." Caleb shook his head, his face pale. "There's no time." Panic set in, each man trying to convince Caleb to take him. Drew thought of Erica, her face flashing before his eyes. He lunged at Caleb, but Mason was quicker, grabbing Caleb by the arm. Mason's eyes were wild, desperate, and Caleb looked like he was about to break down. "Please, Caleb," Drew begged, his voice trembling. "I have someone waiting for me. You have to understand." Before they could decide, there was a crash from the front door. Officer Tate had arrived, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. Tate wasn't just any random cop. He had a personal vendetta against Mason. Years ago, Mason had been involved in a petty crime that had indirectly cost Tate a major case, something the officer had never forgotten. The anger simmered beneath Tate's professional demeanor, making his presence here about more than just enforcing the law. Jake, ever the opportunist, raised his hands, his voice trembling in mock fear. "Officer, thank God. They're holding me hostage." Tate paused, his eyes narrowing as he looked at Jake, then at Drew and Mason. Drew felt his entire body tense, his fists clenching at his sides as he locked eyes with Tate. Mason's breath quickened, a nervous tremor escaping his lips. Drew saw the hesitation, the doubt. He had one chance. "He's lying!" Drew shouted. "He set us up!" For a moment, everything was still. Then Tate nodded, stepping forward. Jake, realizing the game was up, bolted toward the back, disappearing into the shadows. Drew grabbed a crowbar, his hands shaking as he moved to the door of the safe room where Jake had fled. His muscles strained with each movement, the crowbar slipping slightly in his sweaty grip as he pried. He gritted his teeth, the metal groaning in resistance, every second feeling like a battle against both the door and his own fear. He pried it open, the metal groaning under the pressure. Inside, Jake had one last card to play, a timed security lock. Drew saw the timer ticking down, his heart sinking. If it hit 0, they'd all be trapped, locked in like a coffin. "Tate, we need help!" Drew screamed, his voice raw. Tate was already at the door, using every ounce of strength to pry it open from the outside. The seconds ticked away, the air growing thin as panic set in. Mason's breathing grew rapid, his fist pounding against the walls in frustration. Liam, barely conscious in the locker, let out a low groan. Drew's heart raced faster, each second feeling like an hour. He thought about Erica again, her voice in his head telling him to stay away from Mason and Liam, to leave the past behind. He wished he had listened. With a final heave, Tate forced the door open, the timer stopping with only seconds left. The door swung wide, and Drew stumbled out, gasping for air. Mason followed, dragging a barely conscious Liam with him. Jake was gone, the high-value items missing, the night ending in chaos. The police stormed the building, securing everyone still inside. Caleb had vanished through the maintenance hatch, leaving behind only questions and the sting of betrayal. Drew looked around, the flashing lights of police cars illuminating the shattered remains of their plan. He thought of Erica, of the warnings he had ignored, and felt the weight of his choices crush him. As they were escorted out of the building, Drew glanced over at Officer Tate. Tate's eyes met his, a mixture of disappointment and pity reflected in his gaze. "You boys had no idea what you were getting yourselves into, did you?" Tate muttered, shaking his head. Drew swallowed hard, his throat dry. He couldn't find the words to answer. They had survived, but they had lost everything. Their trust, their friendship, their belief that they could beat the odds. Drew's mind wandered back to the times when they were younger, when they had each other's backs without question, without greed clouding their judgment. Liam, who had finally regained consciousness, looked dazed as they loaded him into an ambulance. Mason sat on the curb, his face buried in his hands, the weight of their failure crushing him. Drew walked over and placed a hand on Mason's shoulder, feeling the heaviness of the moment between them. They shared a silent understanding. This was the end of something they could never get back. The adrenaline had worn off, leaving behind only exhaustion and regret. Drew watched the officers take Mason and Liam away, his heart heavy. Halloween night had been their coffin, a trap they had willingly stepped into, each nail hammered in by their own greed and desperation. He thought of Erica, of the future he had almost thrown away, and promised himself that if he ever got the chance, he'd make things right. As dawn approached, Drew stood alone in the parking lot, the cold seeping through his jacket. He heard the distant chatter of police radios, the clinking of handcuffs, and the hollow echo of what could have been. This was not the thrill they had hoped for. This was the end of something that once felt like brotherhood. Drew knew there would be no going back to the way things were. The bond they once shared had been shattered, replaced by the harsh truth of betrayal, greed, and the consequences of their actions. He had survived the night, but the scars it left would stay with him forever, a constant reminder of the price of one last thrill. And somewhere in the darkness, Caleb was gone. The locksmith, the only one with the key to their escape, had chosen himself over them. Drew couldn't blame him. In the end, maybe Caleb was the only one who understood the real stakes. That survival sometimes meant leaving others behind. As Drew walked away from the flashing lights and the chaos, he made a silent vow to himself. This was it. No more heists, no more thrill-seeking, no more Liam and Mason. He had someone waiting for him, someone who believed in him, even when he didn't believe in himself. He had been given a second chance, and he wasn't going to waste it. Halloween night had ended, but its shadows lingered, a dark reminder of how close he had come to losing everything. He stepped into his car, the engine rumbling to life as he pulled away from the scene. Drew knew he had a long road ahead, but for the first time in a long while, he felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, he could find his way back to the life he truly wanted, far away from the coffins they had built for themselves.